For more than 2 centuries, the wreck of the slave ship São José lay just 100 meters off the shore of one of the most popular beaches in the mother city, until a global team of archaeologists started diving deep to bring the first few artifacts to the surface. 𝗀𝗁𝗶𝗴𝗶 joined the crew.
In Table Bay alone, we know that there's about 500 historic shipwrecks. We don't know where they all are. Only about 5% of them have been located.
There is still so much to be discovered. 𝗀𝗁𝗶𝗴𝗶 is a maritime archaeologist, and he could also be described as a treasure hunter. But he's more interested in the wealth of understanding the past than finding gold or silver. 50 years ago, a shipwreck was discovered off the beach at Clifton. In the 80s, it was speculated that it may be a Dutch East India Company ship. 𝗀𝗁𝗶𝗴𝗶 and an international team, including academics from George Washington University and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History, started diving the wreck again about 7 years ago.
Diving on the wreck, we realized that it couldn't be the one that they identified it as because it's too late. We found ballast blocks. We found shackles.
The shackles hinted to a darker history. 𝗀𝗁𝗶𝗴𝗶 spent many hours in the Western Cape Archive Library, scouring the records to see if he could find a mention of another ship that had sunk off the coast. He literally struck gold when he read the captain's account of the wrecking of a ship called the São José Paquete d'Africa in 1794, below Lion's Head during a treacherous Cape storm.
The São José was a Portuguese slave ship that was headed from Mozambique to Brazil, transporting approximately 500 enslaved Africans.
Men, women and children were packed 𝗀𝗁𝗶𝗴𝗶 into the ship's hold and set sail for Cape Town. They were treated as commodities, neglected in appalling conditions. It is estimated that about 80,000 slaves were brought to the Cape between 1652 and 1808, when slavery was finally abolished. They were shipped to the Cape at the behest of Jan van Riebeeck.
Soon after Jan van Riebeeck arrived in the Cape in 1652, he realized that to supply passing ships with fresh food and sustenance and to build the necessary infrastructure for the settlers, he needed a large workforce. And that is how the slave trade began here.
After 24 days of being in the bowels of the ship, the São José slaves were dealt another blow when it ran into submerged rocks in Camps Bay, about 100 meters from the shoreline.
On the night of 27th December, the São José was hugging the Cape Coast because the captain was not certain of the conditions. It was one of his first voyages around the Cape. They struck a rock because of variable winds, and the ship eventually got stuck between 2 reefs. The crew then saved themselves, but in the process unshackled some of the slaves. Unfortunately, they did not get to unshackle all of them because 212 of the slaves perished on the ship.
Chained down with heavy shackles, they had no way to escape.
Why is the discovery of the São José wreck so important?
Well, firstly and foremostly, it's a physical marker. But here's a physical marker on a very popular beach in a very wealthy area where there's actually a ship that has been, the divers have gone down, found it, brought things up, and that ship was carrying 500 slaves. 200 of them drowned there. So in many ways, that's a sacred site. For those of us who believe that the wall is not solid between life and death, for one's ancestors, it's extremely important. The 300 that survived were sold in Cape Town, so they are ancestors. So what this event does is it causes us to stop and think.
Tariq Mele is a historian and heritage activist. He has researched his genealogy, and 26 of his forefathers and mothers were slaves.
Can you tell the story of South Africa without including slavery?
Absolutely not. The reason being that every farm, town, the city in this part of the world was built by slaves. The economy was built by slaves for almost 200 years. And when you factor this out, you literally factor out 3/4 of our history.
There are many places in Cape Town where one can still see the historical remnants of slavery, like the mosques in 𝗀𝗂𝗿𝗆 and this, the very first slave church in South Africa that's on Long Street.
This plaque also commemorates where the slave tree stood, the meeting point where thousands of slaves were sold.
My grandmother has passed on, but before she died, she told me ons was slawe van Java. Those were words to me when I asked her, where do we come from?
Shanaaz Gallant is the curator at the 𝗀𝗁𝗃𝗃 Slave Lodge Museum in Cape Town, and they have a permanent São José exhibition. The lodge was built 340 years ago and possibly housed some of her ancestors who may have been VOC slaves.
Tell me about the human rights violations that they endured.
The fact that they were chattel slavery, they were regarded as property, right? They were terribly violated and abused, and there's extensive records of the type of abuse that they endured. Rape, severe beatings, torture. It's a dark and ugly history.
The majority of slaves came from African countries, but also India, Sri Lanka, and the Indonesian archipelago, literally creating our rainbow nation.
You know, I've got an opinion that anyone whose family's been in South Africa for more than 200 years have got slave ancestry. So I feel in a little way that I'm sort of telling the story of my ancestors to an extent.
Small and round, it looked almost like it's got a rivet on it.
Oh, it might be a rivet. Stick them together and make up a shackle.
What artifacts have you brought up?
Okay, so far we've brought up some ballast blocks. We've brought up one piece of ship structure. 3 of those ballast blocks and the ship structure and a pulley block that we brought up are on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. We've got quite a few copper fastenings, nails. We brought up some shackles. They're not on exhibition because they're quite fragile. We're still busy treating those. And we're planning to lift a cannon from the site.
Tell me more about the cannons.
In the 1980s, a group of divers pulled out the cannon and they left it on the side of the beach in Clifton, so we recovered that one. But they didn't preserve it, so it's falling apart, so we can't tell much from that cannon. And so we've got one on the site which we want to lift and then treat properly and conserve, and that will probably tell us a little bit more, hopefully, about where it was, the ship was built maybe.
This is the ballast block. This over here that was used to weigh down the ship.
They were able to identify the wreck as the São José because the ship logs show they had hundreds of iron ballast blocks to offset the weight of the human cargo. This is the first historically documented shipwreck in the world with enslaved Africans on board.
It's been so long. Have you found any human remains?
We haven't found any yet. There's a good likelihood it's possible, but you know, it's not something I can predict.
Although they have not found any bones yet, they have found bits of fabric which could have belonged to the slaves.
It's 2019. Why are people still finding it a difficult conversation to have?
There tends to be a silence around it, and only once we start telling these stories do we break the silence, and then people who descended from slaves start to understand who they are and where they're from, and then also how strong our people were to have survived some of the ugliest things that man commit against another man and woman and children.
This is still an active dive. Because the wreckage is strewn so far, it is going to take many years to uncover the secrets it holds.